G'day and welcome to another video on my channel. Today we're going to do another gun review video. Now today we're looking at an Erma-Werke Model EG71 22 long rifle, lever action obviously, rifle. Now these are not uncommon throughout the world. You see them here in Australia. There seems to be plenty of them, well they're made in Germany. We'll be getting onto that shortly. There seems to be plenty of them in Europe, and they're also in America. They also go under some other names. In North America, they may be marked as a Ithaca Model 72, and a little bit later on as a Iver Johnson Wagonmaster. They're all the same rifle. They were just marked or marketed under different names at different times. So this rifle has quite an interesting history. This rifle has a history obviously from the past, but it also goes right through to the present. This rifle is the precursor of the modern Henry Rifle Company's original 22 lever action rifle, the H001. It's actually basically the same design, and we're going to talk in depth about how that came about. Alright, so what we might do now is just have a bit of a look at the history of the Irma company, going back to its beginning and taking us through to when this rifle was made in the early 70s. So the company started in 1922 when Berthold Geipel started a company in the city of Erfurt, which is in central Germany, and the company was called the Erfurter Maschinen- und Werkzeugfabrik. My apologies to German speakers. GmbH, which is sort of like a company, just a company designation. And that is translated as the Erfurt Machine and Tool Company. So if you look at the Erfurter Maschinen part and you take the first two letters of those words, that's where Irma comes from. So Irma became an unofficial acronym of the company name. And the company engaged in general machining, tool making and manufacture. In a fairly short space of time though, in the early 1930s, Hitler had come to power, and he ignored the Treaty of Versailles and started a build-up of all sorts of arms for the German military. This included small arms. Geipel managed to get a contract to produce K98K rifle.
This is a picture of an actual Irma-produced K98K rifle.
In the early 1930s, and Irma continued to make them right through the 1930s and through the Second World War, and basically until the end of the war. Geipel obviously could see the opportunities in arms manufacture that were on the horizon, so as soon as the Mauser production line was up and running, he bought the rights from another gun designer called Heinrich Vollmer. And he bought the rights to a machine pistol. Now Vollmer had been working on a series of submachine guns in 9mm.
Vollmer had been working on a series of submachine guns in 9mm Parabellum, continuing the work of Hugo Schmeisser, who had introduced the MP18 during the First World War and improving on that design.
Now of course the MP18 was the first successful, it's the first submachine gun of any type as far as I'm aware, developed by the Germans during the First World War, and it did see service right at the end of the war.
In this photo, the top firearm is actually an MP18. It's got a Vollmer designed prototype weird magazine on it. But the rifle we're interested in is the one at the bottom. That's Vollmer's submachine pistol. As you can see, it's he's taken the barrel shroud off, and it actually has a telescoping magazine that's a modification from the MP18 to make it more compact and also to make it easier to disassemble.
And his prototype was called the VMP 1930. So when in 1931 Irma bought Vollmer's design, they continued working on the machine pistol.
They made several modifications to Vollmer's design, including re-establishing the barrel jacket like the MP18 originally had, and they designated the new firearm the Erma EMP, or Irma Maschinenpistolen.
And this actually was a commercial, wasn't a huge success, but it was a commercial success. It was manufactured commercially, and it was adopted by the German SS, as well as being sold to Spain, Mexico, China and Yugoslavia. So what the EMP was a wooden stock select fire submachine gun, had a charging handle and ejection port on the right hand side, and the magazine protruded horizontally to the left and slightly forward, so it's a weird looking thing with the forward sloping magazine sticking out to the left. So there were modifications and sub-models during its production, but in 1936 they did a major redesign to try to just fix up any problems or complaints that they had about this one.
The resulting gun was known as the EMP36. The magazine was actually rotated down. It wasn't completely vertical, it was 33 degrees from vertical, but the most significant feature, it was the first firearm with a folding metal stock, which we're quite familiar with today in small military firearms. Another major modification that should be noted is that the charging handle was changed from the right to the left side, which enabled the shooter to maintain a grip on the pistol and control of the trigger with his right hand, assuming he's a right-handed shooter, while charging it with his left hand, which made it easier.
And they designed a folding metal stock, so this was the first submachine gun with what we now kind of see as quite a standard feature on a lot of submachine guns and assault rifles, is that folding metal stock. They made prototypes, but it wasn't actually, in a short period of time, it wasn't adopted by anyone, it wasn't made commercially. However, in January of 1938, the German, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, the Army Weapons Office requested a lightweight, compact and rapid firing weapon for paratroopers and tank crews. So this is just before the war started. So they had the MP36 design, and because they already had the basic design of the action there, they were already contracted to the government producing Mausers. Guy Pell was pretty confident that if they could redesign the weapon to fulfill the requirements, he was fairly confident of getting a contract. So the company put considerable resources into the project, and the resulting submachine gun, or machine pistol as they called them, was the MP38.
The most notable differences in the MP38 is the barrel shroud was removed, and the magazine well is now it's completely vertical, so the magazine sticks down vertically from the gun.
By the summer of 1938, there were prototypes available for testing by the Wehrmacht. They were very impressed. The gun was accepted and contracted for widespread adoption. So Irma began manufacturing them, and Heinel also manufactured them under license. And about 40,500 were produced. During this period, of course, the war had started, and so they were seeing service. But the MP38 was all manufactured out of machine parts, and Irma began looking at how to make it cheaper and quicker to manufacture. So basically what they did, using basically the same design, but they began using stampings for the receiver. It was fairly new technology at that time, but they put a lot of resources into developing dies, and they designed a gun that was basically the same design as the MP38 but with stamped receiver parts. And this was released in 1940 as the MP40.
During its production, almost 870,000 MP40s were produced by Irma, as well as Heinel and Steyr in Austria. It's one of the most recognisable German small arms of World War II. It was widely used by Germans and also others who managed to capture them off the Germans. And even today, it's often seen in video games and popular culture.
It was often called the Schmeiser, by English speakers, especially at the end of the war, but that's a misnomer because Hugo Schmeisser had no part in its design, apart from possibly some aspects of its magazine which were borrowed from his design. In 1944, things weren't going so well for the German war effort, and the German government was looking at various concepts of trying to arm their troops with firearms that were much more cheaper and quicker to produce.
Irma quite quickly designed a basic submachine gun based on welded tube steel, same sort of concept as the Sten gun, which was designated the EMP-44.
And they were quite impressed with it actually, but it wasn't adopted because at the same time they were developing the STG-44 Sturmgewehr assault rifle, which was the first assault rifle which used a intermediate cartridge.
Developed by Heinel, they were made by them, but also in large numbers by Irma, who of course had expertise in stamping, because these are largely stamped guns. They were originally called the MP-44, but later renamed by Hitler, the Sturmgewehr. And they did see service in the closing year of the war, but they weren't fielded in large enough numbers to have any difference to the outcome.
This was thought to have more promise, and they thought that if they could arm all their troops so that they had an auto assault rifle, it would be beneficial. Now in February of 1945, British bombers targeted the Irma factories and they were almost completely destroyed. So then the war ended and Erfurt ended up being in the Russian occupied zone of Germany, what was to become East Germany. And Berthold Geipel was imprisoned in a labour camp and underwent denazification re-education because of his close links and work with the Nazi Party. So he was there for a while. He was eventually released, and but while he was in the labour camp, the Irma, of course, the factories had been pretty much destroyed, but the actual business and all the assets of the Irma company was dissolved, and the assets were dissolved, and any proceeds were just taken by the communist state. I suspect that Geipel probably had other money in in Switzerland or whatever. He actually managed, after his release from the re-education camp, he managed to actually escape across the lines of control to the western part of Germany, controlled by the Allies. And there he went to work for his old friend Heinrich Vollmer, who had a manufacturing company in the western part of Germany, and he was the assistant director. So he did that for a little while, but then in 1949 Geipel established a new manufacturing company in Bavaria, which he named Erma-Werke. So work meaning works. So his son Rudolf was obviously a mechanical engineer. He was the chief engineer, and the company initially concentrated on making household items or household appliances, because apparently there was a very emerging demand for those at the time. And then in 1952 the company moved to Dachau near Munich, and they managed to secure a large contract with the German police forces to maintain and rebuild their small arms. So obviously because of the Irma's, the previous Irma company, so this is the second Irma company, but the previous Irma company's expertise in small arms manufacture. Now the main thing that they did was the repair and manufacture of replacement parts for surplus US M1 carbines. In 1949, the US had actually given 19,000 surplus US carbines, M1 carbines, to the German forces for use, in policing the sort of occupied zone. And then in 1955, another 34,000. So I guess as the Americans were leaving, instead of taking all the huge amounts of M1 carbines that they had back to the US, they just gave them as sort of military aid. So there was 34, so like 53,000 M1 carbines, which had probably seen a fair bit of service already by that time, needed rebuilding, maintenance, parts made. So that kept them fairly busy. And then in 1955, that's when West Germany, the new nation of West Germany, was formed, and they decided that they required a submachine gun. Now Guy Pell, thought, oh right, here we go, this is right up my alley, and so he was very optimistic in being able to design a gun and obtain a contract to supply the new West German army. So again, just like he did back in 1938, he poured considerable resources into the development of a suitable weapon.
A range of submachine gun prototypes were designed, including this one. This is the MP56. This is the MP58. This is the MP59. And then the final design that they submitted was called the MP60.
Unfortunately, it was a fairly outdated stamped design, had a wire stock, and it didn't have select fire, it was full auto only, and it wasn't really that well received. And at the same time, the Uzi had just been developed by the Israelis, and that was actually submitted for the trials, and that won the trial. So the problem was Guy Pell had spent huge amounts of money developing this MP60 submachine gun, which went nowhere, and this went close to bankrupting the Erma-Werke company. And in 1961, Guy Pell was forced to sell to an industrial conglomerate named Fiberglide. So Guy Pell and his son Rudolf, they had no further association with the Erma-Werke company. If we go back to Germany, even prior to World War II, 22 training rifles were very common, especially 22 training versions of actual common military rifles of the same size and heft and all that had a long history in Germany. And because the German government had 55,000 M1 carbines, they were interested in a 22 training version of the M1 carbine to be able to train the police. So in the late 50s, Irma designed a simple blowback carbine. It looked and hefted very similar to an M1, but it had based on a alloy receiver. And so this project was quite advanced when they were forced to sell and Fiberglide took over. So the project continued and production commenced in the early 50s. So the receiver, the bolt, the trigger guard and trigger, they're all made from Zamac, a zinc magnesium alloy that was starting to become common in a lot of uses at that time. So the alloy is lighter and cheaper than steel, but has ample strength for this sort of use. So this 22 version, the M1 carbine, was designated the EM1, and it was favourably received, and it was purchased in large numbers by the German government and also a lot of other countries as well as a training rifle. But then they also started making them commercially as well, and they were a huge success commercially. Because of the success of the EM1, Irma sort of realised that if they could make other World War II themed firearms, firearms that looked like genuine World War II era firearms but were cheaper and in 22, blowback designs, they probably could do quite well. So they immediately started developing them, and they very quickly developed a 22 blowback copy of the Luger called the LA22, one of the Walther P38, the EP882, and the Walther PPK EP752, among others. And they also did make quite a few other firearms, sporting firearms. So all of these pistols looked pretty much the same as their real counterparts, but they were made of alloy, or the main frames, receivers were made of alloy, and they were simple blowback. They weren't lock breech like the actual pistols that they were designed around, and they were also very reasonably priced. So in the USA, this sort of thing had a huge market, and so there was a gentleman by the name of Louis Imperato.
Lou had a firearms importing company, and he seemed to develop a close relationship with Irma, and he was the importer into the United States of all of Irma's firearms.
Now, so let's just have a look at his life. Lou was born in 1933 in Brooklyn, New York, and in his late teens he served in the Korean War. And after his discharge, he went to work in the John Giovino gun shop in Manhattan. Now, this gun shop was founded in 1911 and was the main supplier of firearms and accessories like holsters to the New York Police Department. So at the time when Lou went to work for it, it was owned by a gentleman named Frank Albanese. It was actually in the Little Italy part of Manhattan. And then in 1955, Lou married Frank's daughter Rita, and he actually, they took over the management of the gun shop. So his importing company was called LA Distributors. So a lot of the shooting publications at that time were full of advertisements for the guns that he was importing. I'll show you a couple of ads that I found in old copies of Guns magazine.
Here's a couple of examples of two firearms we've already talked about.
So he was actually importing surplus military firearms as well as European sporting guns. At one stage he must have purchased from the Australian government 43,000 Australian Lithgow SMLE No. 1 Mark III Star rifles and imported them into the USA. So probably just about all of the No. 1 Mark III Star SMLEs that are in the USA were probably part of this batch, most likely. And that's why there seems to be more of those in the USA than there actually is here in Australia. So the other thing that LA Distributors did was they came to agreements with some of the American gun companies and actually imported European firearms that were sold under and branded under the American gun companies' names, often marked as such as well. So one of these that was doing this was the Ithaca Gun Company. Now they'd been going since 1883, and in the early days they specialised in shotguns, I think, but they made all sorts of firearms in the early days. But by this time they were quite a small company compared to the big Winchester, Remington, Savage, Marlin. And during this period they designed a rifle called the Model 49, which looked very much like a traditional, Winchester style lever action design.
The Ithaca Model 49 looked like a traditional lever action rimfire rifle, but was in fact a falling block single shot rifle.
And these sold well apparently and were quite popular, they're pretty cheap. But at this time, this was a period of TV was widespread by now, and there was all sorts of TV shows, Bonanza and all these sort of things, Lone Ranger and whatever. There was a big demand for Western style firearms. They didn't have to be exactly what they used, but if they looked and functioned similar, there was a big market for them, especially if they were cheap. So Ithaca was quite keen to get a lever action repeater. So they did have an in-house design team, obviously, who attempted to kind of redesign the basic frame of this Model 49, but actually make it into a repeater.
This was designated the Model 49R for repeater.
Which they did, and it went on the market, and it was an absolute disaster because it just had all sorts of mechanical problems. and many had to be returned for repairs or replacement, and then in the end the company recalled them all, probably destroyed them, and apparently they're quite rare now because there wasn't many of them, you know, left out there. Anyway, so Lou had close ties with Ithaca, and if you look on the Rimfire Central forum site, which is a great site by the way, I look at it all the time, but there's this urban myth which is actually propagated on that forum that Lou Imperato designed the Erma EG71 so that then, you know, it could be brought to the US and sold by Ithaca. But I know that is not true for several reasons. One is that Lou, you know, went to Korea when he was like 18, and then so he didn't go to university, had no engineering or drafting or anything background, and then he came back and, you know, got into the gun trade. So this is quite a sophisticated design of rifle, so which you'll see when we pull it apart. So there's no way he just kind of designed this rifle. This, you know, is a fabulous design, and then said, here you go, Irma, you make this. If you look at the fact that Irma was making all these other firearms on alloy kind of receivers, but making them externally similar to other firearms, it's basically, this is exactly what this is. So there's no doubt this was designed by Irma. Now it's possible that Lou may have said to Irma, hey, you guys, you know, if you could design a really nice looking 22 lever action that works well and whatever, I'll have a huge market for it in the USA. And Irma may have gone, oh yeah, okay, we'll put our design team onto it. So I suspect, you know, either that happened or maybe Irma just designed it off their own bat, and then Lou of course said, oh yes, I'll import that in the USA, that'll do well. But anyway, Irma began production of the EG71 in 1970, and I know that because even though it's EG71, which is its year of when it came out, I have actually seen on the net some rifles with a 1970 proof on them, so they must have started making them in 1970, you know, probably marking them, and they probably released in 71. So let's just have a look at the externals of it here. So in general layout, it has a receiver very reminiscent of a Winchester, you know, apart from the screws. On this side you'd think it was a Winchester 92 or 94. On this side with a little ejection port, it looks a bit like a 94-22.
Here we are at the range, so I apologise for the noise in the background, but I just took this opportunity to film these two rifles together. One of the shooters out here has got a Winchester 94-22, and there's my little Irma EG71. So let's just have a look at the comparison of it. If we look at the Winchester, you can see this is a solid steel receiver. It looks like this part's separate to the tang there. The tang and the base are a separate part. But you've got there's no screw through the tang that way. So there must be a through bolt through the stock, I guess. So that's a bit of a difference. But you've got similar sort of sight, similar sort of forend setup, magazine, slightly longer barrel, and again the side is a separate part to this, and that looks like it's steel, and this band is steel too. So plastic butt plate. So we compare it to the Irma alloy butt plate, screw through the tang. We've got the aluminium cover and the screws, but once we get forward, the forend similar, alloy band instead of steel, and then alloy sight and band all in one piece. So if we look at the way the Winchester locks, again a similar sort of breech block, but you can see it actually locks by the bolt moving up into a slot into the receiver. See that? Whereas the Irma, the bolt is just back and forth, and it's actually a locking block that moves. So that's a mechanical difference.
We'll go through, or we'll pull it apart shortly, and you can see how it actually goes together. Almost immediately when these came out, Lou Imperato started importing them into the USA, and probably Canada too, I would imagine. And these were actually called the Ithaca Model 72. So that was actually, would have been marked on the top. It wouldn't have said Irma, it would have said Ithaca Model 72, and then still would have said made in West Germany. And then in 1972, they actually introduced a pump action rifle, carbine, with the same basic receiver, you know, magazine, but a pump action, which actually operated the mechanism. That was called the EG72. But I don't think it ever sold very well because there's very little informational photos or anything about that on the net. But then in 1973, Irma actually redesigned this slightly and produced a 22 Magnum version of it, and that was called the EG73. So obviously it was just basically everything looked pretty much the same. Obviously they just had to make the whole loading system in here a little bit bigger to be able to handle the Magnum length cartridges. But when they did that, when they designed that rifle, there was a major redesign they did of the loading system, and you'll see when we delve into the rifle that the EG71 has a cartridge lifter very similar to the old Winchester Model 1873, the Henry, designed by Henry, which lifts the cartridge straight up and then it's pushed into the chamber. Whereas when they brought out the Magnum EG73, they redesigned it. They replaced this cartridge block with a fixed cartridge guide with a slot inside it that the cartridge fed into, and then just a thin arm which actually lifted them up for the bolt to push forward. And that was the main design change in this rifle, on this basic rifle platform. And it's actually quite important because that design change then went right through and is still current in the Henry rifles today. I mean, these, I've sort of let the cat out of the bag, but these actually became the first modern Henry 22 rifles. Now it's time to introduce another old American firearms manufacturing company, and that's the Iver Johnson Company. Now most of you have probably heard of them. Back in the day, they started in 1871. Back in the day they specialised in little economical handguns, little revolvers I think, and I think they also made some little boys' rifle. Like Ithaca, by the 1950s they weren't a particularly large manufacturing company like the other big ones. And in 1973 the company was purchased by Lou Imperato in partnership with another investor. I think by that time I don't know that they were actually even making anything. I think they were just selling like European firearms that were rebadged. Lou then continued importing the EG71, but of course instead of importing them for Ithaca, they were now badged as Iver Johnson Wagonmasters. The model name was stamped on the barrels. At this point, Irma also started marking the rifles that weren't for the American market, that were being sold here and Europe and wherever. They also marked the barrels Wagonmaster, and probably just so they didn't have to have two production lines, they could just make all the barrels and have Wagonmaster on them all. And I've actually got a barrel from here in Australia that's marked Wagonmaster. And they also sold the EG73, the 22 Magnum version, but they didn't have a different model name. It was also just called the 22 Magnum Wagonmaster, Iver Johnson. Now if we go back to the Irma EG71 production, after some years of production, there was a few changes that they made to the rifles. I'll just quickly go through them now, and we might look closer at them later on. One of them was that they actually, these 4 screws that hold the receiver on, they just made them bigger, basically, and made the recess in the cover bigger, probably just to allow easier takedown without damaging the screws. They changed them such that instead of having all markings and the serial number on top of the cover, probably for you know, the licensing kind of regimes of places like here in Europe. They changed the marking. They took the marking off the top so that the covers had nothing on them at all, and I've got one of those. They put the marking, the Erma-Werke made in Germany and caliber and all that, on the barrel here on the left hand side, I think on both sides, and they started marking the serial number on the bottom of the bottom part of the receiver. But there was one other major mechanical thing that they did, which is doesn't seem to be widely known. I now own several Irma rifles and parts, so I've kind of discovered this through comparison, is an outer battery safety. Now, I won't go into it now, because I'll show it to you closely later on in the video. They redesigned the locking block and the hammer to produce an outer battery safety, so that as soon as the hammer was opened like that, the hammer could no longer hit the cartridge. Now that was still in the EG71, it was still the same model rifle. But late in the 70s, they actually did a major redesign of the inside of the rifle and basically made it the same lifter system as the EG73 Magnum version, wherein they got rid of the Henry style block which goes up and down, vertical block, and they replaced it with a solid cartridge guide, which the cartridges came up through, being pushed upwards by an arm. What I would suggest you do, if you want to sort of work out what the difference is between these two systems, is watch the rest of my video where I'll show you the inside of this rifle in depth. And then if you go to the Henry website, there's a bit there on maintenance, I think, and they've actually got disassembly videos of most of their main firearms, and there is actually a disassembly video of the Henry H001, so you can actually see them pull it apart, and you can actually see the design of the lifter mechanism and see the difference from what it is in these early Irmas. Now, the main reason that I think that they changed the lifter design was that this lifter, vertical Henry style lifter, can only handle a cartridge's specific length, because it's the cartridge length that stops the next cartridge come through, and then it's lifted up, and then as soon as it goes down, the next cartridge goes into it. So it can't handle long or short or long cartridges, only long rifle only. Whereas the main competitors in the US, the 94-22 and the Browning, the Marlin 39A and the Browning levers, I think they can all shoot short, long rifle. So by changing the design, they were then able to handle all three cartridge lengths, and that was actually began to be marked on the rifle.
In this picture, the top diagram is the EG71 and the bottom diagram is the EG712, which is essentially the same as the EG73 and also the Henry H001. Now if you look at the lifter in the top one, you can see the lifter with its lever, you can see the little ball bearing and its little spring, and you can also see number 33, the ejector. If you go to the bottom diagram, you'll see the whole lifter shape has completely changed. There's no longer the ball, the lever's different, you've got that big block, and you'll note that the ejector is not shown anywhere because the ejector becomes part of that block.
Now when Irma redesigned the rifle, it actually became the Irma model EG712, and out of interest they did the same thing to the pump action model 72, and that became the model 722, so it's just the updated version. So then in the 1990s, Irma started getting into financial problems. Irma actually ceased trading in 1997, but in the late 1980s, Lou Imperato purchased the Henry, this is going back a few years before Irma finished, But Lou Imperato obviously had a plan in his mind, and he purchased the Henry brand name. Now Henry, of course, was the original firearms company which made the first lever action Henry rifle. Then that kind of went bust, and then that was bought by Oliver Winchester. This is back in the 1850s, 60s. Oliver Winchester, he didn't know anything about guns, he was simply an entrepreneur. He just had money. He used to make shirts, apparently. When it became the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, they still owned the Henry name all the way for the next century and more. They still owned the Henry brand name. Now, by the 1980s, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company had been bought by this big Olin corporation. Well, I think they owned the brand names. They were making ammunition, and I think they were contracting the rifle production out to another Winchester manufacturing company. It's all very complex, all these company names. But anyway, the bottom line is they still owned the Henry brand name. So in the late 1980s, Lou Imperato somehow managed to purchase the Henry brand name from the Olin Corporation. You know, and at this stage he was still selling these as Iver Johnson Wagonmasters. And then in 1993, he sold the Iver Johnson. Well, the Iver Johnson company ceased operation. The Iver Johnson brand name was sold to someone else, and it's still used today for something or other. And at about the same time, Irma was in financial difficulties, and Lou Imperato was able to purchase the manufacturing rights, and possibly, most likely, even some of the tooling or manufacturing machinery to produce this, the Carbine, the EG Carbine designs. Now, I think the reason I think he probably did purchase tooling is that if you look at, you'll see later when we pull this apart, the actual design of the bottom part of the receiver has all these kind of cuts. Well, it's actually cast, I think, cast in that machine. It's got all these quite complex little cuts and designs. And when I look at the Henry video of a modern Henry rifle being disassembled, all those cuts and everything are identical, absolutely identical to the receiver, the lower receiver in this rifle, even down to the little part where the external ejector, which the Henry doesn't even have, fits. That little slot is still in the receiver. So that's what makes me fairly certain that he actually bought the tooling to be out, and he just is still making the receivers the same, exactly the same, or no, maybe not exactly, because they probably did modify them a bit for the loading, but almost exactly the same as the lower receiver in this. Okay, so then in 1996, Lou, along with his son Anthony, established the Henry Repeating Arms Company. So the Henry's first rifle was designated the H001, and as I said, it was nothing more than just an American-made version of the Erma-Werke EG71. Now in the first one there was a couple of obvious differences that I have been made aware of. This barrel band and the front barrel band and the sight, instead of being made of alloy like this one is, a Zamac probably, they were made of plastic. This dovetail that the sight goes into in the barrel is really big. It's about half as big again as a standard 3/8 inch dovetail in your general American rifle. So obviously, you know, being made in the USA, Henry just made this a standard 3/8 inch dovetail because the tooling would be cheap for them to get for that. Would be one reason, and the other reason would be if someone wants to change the sight, they can just buy any Marble, William, whatever 3/8 inch dovetail sight and put it into the dovetail. So those two were different. This has got an alloy butt plate, the Henry one's plastic, and the magazine follower, which I didn't mention in the EG71 too. They actually changed the design of the magazine follower slightly. They changed from simple little button sort of follower that sticks out the end of the magazine to a sort of a long one with a sphere on the end that's actually is able to move outside of its central plane a bit. In the Erma rifles it was made of steel, I think, and in the Henry rifles it's made of red plastic. So so there are a few details. I haven't actually been able to. I've handled a Henry rifle, but I haven't been able to, look inside, pull one apart or whatever. Now, one thing that comes up on forums a lot is people say, "Oh, I've got a Erma EG73, something's broken, this is broken, or whatever. Can I get a part from Henry and will it fit?" And the answer to that question is, I don't know. When I look at the Henry, there's a few differences. Like this has got a solid machine steel hammer. The Henry seems to have a cast looking hammer with a kind of hollow bit in the inside. I don't know about some of the internal parts, the locking block, whether that's machined or whatever. Clearly if you've got an old Irma, none of the loadings, the cartridge lifting stuff is going to fit. But as far as hammers, the pin sizes, the locking block, stuff like that, I simply don't know. They look the same when I compare them on YouTube videos, but and they may even look the same if you put them next to each other, but unless the dimensions are identical, who knows? If someone out there who lives in the Brisbane or Sunshine Coast area has a Henry rifle, a Henry 22 rifle, that they're willing to lend me and let me dismantle, I'd be quite happy to put up a whole video and we'll check all the different parts and do a definitive video of what is the same and what isn't. Yeah, so back to the Henry Rifle Company. So Henrys have sold more than I don't know which models, but this is these ones are one of their budget main models. They've sold over 1 million rifles, and the Henry Firearms Manufacturing Company is now in the top 2 or 3 biggest firearms manufacturing companies in the world, in the USA and probably in the world. Basically what we've got is a alloy receiver cover. Now this is made of Zamac, which is zinc magnesium alloy. This is actually a cover. What you'll see later on, I'll actually show, we're going to do a detailed teardown of this rifle as part of this video. You will see how it goes together, but there's actually another aluminium receiver inside that the barrel and magazine and everything are connected to, and this outside part just comes off. Steel lever. We got a beach buttstock and again I think it's a Zamac alloy butt plate on there. We've got a steel hammer and steel breech bolt in there, which you'll see a bit later. Just a typical elevator type sight. On the front end of the rifle we've got a typical magazine that you see in 22 rifles with the inner and outer tube. Fore end's retained by this band which has a screw through it from the other side and it's tapped in there. The barrel's 18.5 inches long. It has this alloy sight ramp. Well, the actual sight itself, the sight bead, is actually integral to the ramp. Whereas the sight hood is actually a stamped steel hood that can be removed. And the ramp is actually integral with this barrel band. So, and it's just held by a pin between the two. The magazine in this one is actually a steel tube, it's quite tight to pull out. There we go. As you can see, instead of being brass, it's actually made of steel, which is a bit unusual. Although I have a magazine from a later rifle, which is actually has a slightly different end on it, and it's brass. And it's actually got just got a magazine tube as normal, but instead of having a lifter that most of these tube-fed rifles have a lifter on a pivot that'll pivot up and push the cartridges up. This actually has, I don't know if you can see that. Let's turn it over this way. Here it comes. See that? See if we can get it closer. It's got a lifter that actually moves vertically up and down, just like the original old Henry designed lifter in the original Henry volcanic pistols, Henry rifle, and of course the 70 the 66, 73 and 76 model Winchester rifles. Obviously there's quite a few differences. They actually eject out of the top, but just the way you've got a lifter coming up with the cartridge sitting in it is a little bit reminiscent of that. So when we pull the rifle apart a little bit later on, you'll be able to have a much better look at how that whole system works. But one thing that these are renowned for, I've read this in a lot of forums and it does seem to be the case, is they're beautifully smooth. There's very, as you push the lever, there doesn't seem to be any spots where it stops or, you know, you have to push against or anything. It's just one smooth action. And then when it comes up here, you'll see it gets to that point, and then there's actually a locking. It actually locks into battery there. So even though that, see how that locks? So it's got quite a positive lock to it. This rifle has no safety. It does have a safety notch on the hammer if you look at that. Let's have a look and see if we can get that closer. See, that's actually a safety notch on the hammer. See, the hammer goes down a bit further. There we go. So there is a safety notch. So that's actually designed so that if you're cocking the hammer and your finger slips off, it will catch it and not let it hit the firing pin. But there's no actual half cock notch. It cocks all the way through. And no manual safety. Now that dovetail is miles bigger than your standard 3/8 inch American style dovetail. So you can't just buy a sight to replace it very easily. It's probably a metric sort of size. It looks like it's like about 12 mils or 15 mils or something like that. So if to have any hope of getting a sight, you'd have to get an original Irma sight. There's no markings on the barrel, but if we look at the markings on here, Erma-Werke Model EG71, caliber 22 long rifle, serial number, made in West Germany. So if we have a look at these proof marks, I just got my proof mark book out for interest sake. So that one on the left, that's actually, I know it doesn't look like anything, but you can see there. See, generally the Germans used to have these German Eagle proof marks, but then in June 1971 they changed to this stylized German proof mark. So there it is like an eagle with two wings, and so where are we here? So there you go, you can see that one tip of one wing's a bit worn off, but anyway, the next one is actually the proof house where it was proofed. Here's a list of the proof houses: Ulm, Berlin, Kiel, Hanover, Munich, Cologne. And you can see ours is actually, if you look closely at that with a magnifying glass, which I did a minute ago, it is actually this Munich one with a hatching. It's a little shield with hatching. So there's a Munich proof mark, and the next one is the actual definitive proofed in 1972. If we look on the back of the breech block there, I don't know if you can see it. There you go, you can see the stylized eagle mark there. Now we'll start a disassembly of this rifle. So first things first is to take the buttstock off, which is very simple. There's only one screw. Right, next job is to take the 4 screws out of the side of the receiver. So we just find screwdrivers that are fairly narrow, but they should do the job. Okay, now this receiver receiver cover will now come off. So you should be able to just pull it straight up. Now you'll notice that the back of the hammer's now caught there, so we can then pull that down. Now, very important at this point,
Always try to have the rifle lying on its right side when you do this, and the reason being that you need to find this, see that there, that's the ejector, and that would be easily lost. So so just lie it on the right side so that then the ejector's up, and then you can actually just find it, put it to the side. So taking the receiver cover off, the cover has the bolt in it. All the other mechanics of the internals of the rifle are unaffected by taking the bolt out, so they all work normally. So you can see the follower block in there. As we cycle the lever, it lifts the block up, and it's not cocking the hammer now, because this thing here is the thing that pushes the bolt back, and because there's no bolt, the bolt's not cocking the hammer. So at the moment, our loading system and our fire control system are basically disconnected from each other, which is quite good because it means we can look at both of them individually. So as you can see, if you look down in there, you can see that cylindrical thing, and as the bolt comes around, as the lever rotates, you can see it hasn't started impacting on the lifter lever yet, but when you get to a certain point, see, this thing's pushing the bolt back, but when you get to a certain point, it now is raising the lifter. It raises it to the maximum point, which should be lined up with the chamber. And then if you keep watching that cylindrical thing down inside, again, as we lower the lever, it's not actually now, just right at the very end, it pushes the lifter down again. Now the lifter's maintained in the upward position by a ball detent in a hole with a spring behind it, which actually pushes on the side of the receiver, and there's actually a little notch that the ball goes into when it gets to the top of its stroke. So that actually holds it there. If I put some pressure on, it will go down. Now this is an EG71 rifle. In the late 70s, I think it was in about 78, these rifles were modified, and the model designation became the EG712, and basically there was two sort of differences really. There might have been some other subtle differences in the rifle itself, but in the mechanicals, this block system was actually changed to this whole hole here being filled up with a kind of cartridge guide block, and then there was a separate lifter lever that actually ran inside that block and lifted the cartridge up, rather than this large block lifter design. This block just here that you can see in these two screws, that block there is just a lifter guide, so as you can see the lifter, it guides the lifter up. Whereas in the later models, when you take those screws out, there's a big block that goes in there and screws on. Now another difference is, if we look in here, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. If you look just down in there, in that gap next to the locking block, you'll see down the bottom there's around the head of a screw in the bottom of the receiver. Now if we look at the other side of that, there's actually a grub screw there, Allen head grub screw. Now what that is that's actually the lifter height adjustment screw. When this part of the lever here goes backwards as the lever is pushed forward, the end of the stroke is actually stopped by that face hitting the bottom of the receiver. It dictates the height of the lifter. Now, as you can imagine, if that screw was actually screwed in a little bit so it was sticking up, the lever wouldn't be able to go as far and the lifter wouldn't come as high. It's probably just a matter of tolerances and wear. If your lifter is coming up too high and the cartridges are hitting the top of the chamber, you could actually screw that screw in a little bit and the lifter will then not come quite as high. I often read in forums about people who've got these rifles and they say, oh, you know, it doesn't cycle properly and it's unreliable and all this sort of thing. It's a very simple system, and as far as I can see, if it's not cycling properly, there must be something wrong with it. One of those things could be someone could have pulled it apart or not understanding, screwed that screw right in so that the lifter block would then be not coming up high enough like that, and the cartridge would be hitting the bottom of the chamber. So in that case, what you need to do is take it apart like I have, take the cover off like I have, look at your lifter. I mean, if we look at this lifter, see if we get the camera lined up. As you can see, it's pretty well lined up with the chamber. Cartridge is going to go straight in. Another reason why one of these rifles may not work properly, especially if it's not ejecting properly, is it's probably very likely that these ejectors often get lost when people take the covers off. And but it's a nice system, this. Of course, you know, you can clean the rifle from the breech end just simply by removing a few screws, and if you use the right screwdriver and don't damage the screws, it's not really a big deal. You could basically do this to, you know, pull it apart to clean the rifle every time you finish a shooting session. So let's have a look at the way this rifle works. Now we've taken the cover off, which actually contains the bolt. So we've got all the fire control and the feed system here, but without the bolt. Now, as the lever goes back and forth, it's fairly simple. See this thing here, bolt back, bolt forward, bolt back, bolt forward. So if we put that down and get this, now you just got to be very careful about not, when you pick this up, that the bolt doesn't fall out on the floor. So the bolt's quite simple. The firing pin is spring loaded. You can see it's just a flat steel piece, so if it breaks, apparently they do break sometimes, you can actually just make new ones. You know, just get a piece of you know, it's about sort of 2.5 mil steel plate and just cut it out. It's retained by there's a pin there and a pin there, and it has a spring in it obviously. And other than that, the receiver is just simply, the receiver cover is just simply probably cast and then machined alloy, and the bolt simply goes in like that, comes to a stop at the front there, and you can see this is where the barrel trunnion sits. It does have a very interesting locking system though, this. Of course, most 22 rifles that you look at, you know, of course you've got bolt actions, they'll tend to lock just on the bolt handle. That's all that 22 need. Semi-autos are always simple blowbacks, they don't lock at all. And most of the pump action type rifles have the bolt actually will raise up, like my Remington Model 12 for example, the bolt raises up into a recess in the top of the receiver. Now with this, obviously we've taken the receiver off, so, and you can see, so we've looked at the loading system, but you can see this thing here. As soon as the lever starts to be moved, see how that disappears down? It just stays down until the end of the cycle, and as we come back, just before the lever is closed, that comes up. There we go, so we can see now that we've got the bolt in place, and I'm holding that down as the receiver would be, you can see that locking block is actually in that wedge there, so this can't move. As soon as the lever is open that tiny little bit, whoops, need 3 hands to do this. As soon as that lever's open that tiny little bit, that little thing comes down, it unlocks. You can see the light through there now. So it's no longer locked, and the lever just pushes the bolt back and cocks the hammer. Goes back as far as it can. Then on the forward stroke, we're losing our bolt again. Let's try that. On the forward stroke,
If you watch that locking recess as the bolt closes, it locks back up into there. So it's really quite a nice system, really. It's quite different from most other 22s that I've seen. So to dismantle the rifle, the first thing to do is just knock the lever pin out. It'll be slightly under spring tension there, and then knock the pin for the locking block. You see that they're actually being pushed forward by the hammer, so you can actually push the hammer out of the way now. The locking block should just come out like that. Notice that how that little round part actually goes into that slot in the hammer, so just remember that when you put it back in. Take the hammer out. So you can see now, so we've got that little spring sitting in the hole in that receiver at the bottom. That's the locking block spring, and that actually goes in that little hole in the bottom there. So we'll just grab that so we don't lose it, pull it out. Now you note at this stage that I've left the carrier in place at this point, and there's a good reason for that. We'll get to that in a minute. But I've left the hammer in place too. Now what we do at this point, we've still got our trigger and hammer, the steer's still working. So if we carefully lower the hammer, make sure you don't let it go because there's nothing to hold it. Notice that the spring then now comes off. That sort of sits in through there, and that sits in the thing in the back of the hammer. So the spring then came off. So now the hammer and the trigger is loose. Here, look, see that hammer pin just fell out. There's no tension on it. So we go small pin punch, and we can push that pin out, and the trigger will come out as well. So there we go. We've got the action stripped except for the lifter. Now the reason I've left the lifter till last is this: in the right hand side there's actually a ball, spring loaded ball in a hole in the lifter itself. If I was to lift that up, that ball would go flying across the room at high speed. Little tiny ball bearing about 2 millimeters across, and as you can imagine, in certain situations it'll be impossible to find. So anyway, what we might do now is we might get a plastic bag. I'm carefully lifting that up actually. See the ball there? It's just about to appear and go flying across the room. So we'll just put that there like that. I'm not going to lift that up. There we go, the ball just pinged inside the bag. So now we can, there's the ball, the spring's probably still in the lifter. The ball is there. Let's get it out before it gets lost again. He says as he drops it on the floor probably. There we go, I've got it. Right, so we can safely pull this lifter out. There's the little spring. I'll just put it back in its hole for now. So you can see now there's simply this little block. It's sort of like the left cartridge guide. I guess we'll take it out just to show you. You don't really need to, but there we go. So there's the cartridge guide on the inside, and remember, so if you're thinking about which way this goes in, when you're putting it back in, cartridge guide slot goes on the inside, and the bit that's, well, it'll only go one way, because see this bit has to stick up. If you try to put it in the other way, it wouldn't go in because it would be hitting the bottom there. So there's those screws. And there's our action stripped. So we'll take the front barrel band off. off there. Wood comes off. So you notice this barrel has a step in it there. Right, so we can take the magazine out. Anyway, turn this over here. Actually, this has got a pin in it, this. Right, so I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to bother knocking that out now. I'm going to restore this rifle at some stage, so I'll do it then, but I won't bother doing it now. But you'll then notice that there's these 3 pins here, small heads on one side, big heads on the other, so they knock out in that direction. And the bottom one would hold the magazine in. There'd just be a slot in the side of the magazine holding it in. It may be slightly pressed in. And then these 2 big ones would hold the barrel in. And again, the barrel's sitting in this trunnion here. So it may need some tapping from the back to get it out. That's what you would do if you wanted to take the barrel and magazine apart. Assembly is pretty much the reverse of disassembly. I'm not going to go through it because it'll be a bit tedious. There is one trick with putting this together, is if you, now you notice too that I forgot to mention there's a tiny spring goes in the front of the trigger there, so don't lose that. So if you put your trigger in, and the other thing too is there's 4 main pins in this rifle and they're all different, so you don't need to kind of, you know, it'll be obvious which pin is which. See what I mean? This is why I was not going to film assembly, because it's just tedious and difficult. And but I'll just do this bit here because it's sort of important. Alright, so we'll put that pin in there. There we go. So that one in there. We'll get the hammer and we'll put the hammer in its place. Now make sure the trigger is back so that the sear is engaging on the hammer. There we go, wrong screw, wrong pin. That one's too fat, so you can't actually get the pins mixed up because the bigger ones won't go in. Okay, so we've done those, and now you'll notice that the hammer, if we pull the trigger, the hammer will actually go right forward like that, and that's the point where you get your try to do this. If you look in the hammer, there's actually like a little notch in the back of it. Let's see if I can do it. So you got to get that. Ah, there we go. I did do it. There we go. So that's how you do it. It's on the safety notch there. So then what you can do is you can actually cock it all the way. Get this little spring here. Sit it in its hole. In there. And then put the cocking piece there. And put that pin through there. So that's the biggest pin because that's the one that's taken the actual force of the shot. There we go. Now, I won't film the rest because it's just a bit tedious but it's just a matter of putting it all back together. That's the only tricky bit, is that hammer part, getting the hammer back in, because you can't get the hammer back in while the locking block's still there. You have to put it in, get the spring in place, and then put the locking block in. One thing to be aware of is this pin here goes through a couple of different parts. There's the sort of, the lever has that cylindrical part, but then you got to remember that the arm for the lifter goes into that slot. So you have to go, the pin has to go in, catch the part of the lever, and then twiddle around with that arm until the holes line up. It's not very hard, and then your pin will go in. Once you got your pins in, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't forget your little ejector.
I wonder, I haven't actually worked out. I must watch one of these videos of one of the later rifles with a different block. I suspect they might have actually changed this, because this is one issue with this design, I reckon, is this ejector would be so easy to lose. Yeah, there's a bit of a knack to this. It seems to, if you get it right, make sure your bolts all the way in. It goes back in, and if you don't get it right, it doesn't. Part of it is no, there we go. And we got to remember there's that little bit that goes into the slot in the bolt. You got to kind of fiddle with the lever. But anyway, our holes are lined up there. Just cock that. There we go. Take a bit of spring tension off it. I'm going to put these in off. I'd probably do them a bit tighter if I was going to shoot this rifle, but we're in the middle of the old lockdown at the moment, so I'm not allowed to go shooting anyway. And this rifle is going to have a restoration done in the not too distant future, so I'll be pulling it apart again. So I'll put those on super tight. Put the stock on. And there we have it. Alright, so I'm going to attempt to do a demonstration on this action here. I haven't got a barrel in there, but I can introduce a cartridge in from the magazine. And of course you can either have the next cartridge or your follower pushing it. So as you can see, it gets pushed all the way till it's firmly held in the lifter, and with the next cartridge behind it, and you can see actually that it's gone right back to the back of the receiver there. So when the lever's cycled, lifts the cartridge up. So as the lever's closed, the bolt pushes the cartridge into the chamber. So my finger is pretending to be the bolt. There we go. And then, of course, I missed that bit. Hang on. Let's try that again. So you've still got your next cartridge pushing in, and then as the lever is closed, you can see that the lifter starts going down, and once it gets down low enough, it will then allow the spring pressure to push that next cartridge into place, ready to be lifted again. Now I'm going to just discuss a couple of the changes that were made to the design of the EG71 during its production. This is before it was actually modified to the EG714. So these rifles are both EG71 rifles, but I'm going to show you the differences between them. Now this one here is an early one. It's got a proof mark on it of 1972, and that's the first thing we can actually discuss. See, on this one we've got all our proofs. We've got Erma-Werke EG71 etc. made in Germany on the receiver cover, and if we look at the bottom, this is just smooth. There's no numbering on this. So this here in Australia anyway, this cover here is the controlled part because it's got the serial number on it. And in fact I can actually buy basically whole rifles with all the internals, the internal receiver, but without the cover, without any sort of control. I don't have to get our normal permit to acquire and register it and all that, because it's not considered a firearm. It doesn't have the registration. Now if we look at the later ones, this one's a late one. If you look at the cover, it has nothing on it. you see, but if we look underneath, we've actually got our serial number here, and the actual markings are on the barrel. Erma-Werke Model EG71 caliber 22 long rifle. Whereas if we compare that to the other one, the barrel, there's nothing on the barrel. So theoretically in this one, this is the control part and the top part's not. So I mean, I think that's just something that the licensing authorities haven't actually kind of got on top of. But the weird thing is I've actually bought the inside of one of these with a serial number on it without any licensing. So but anyway, that's just worth knowing about. Another difference that's obvious in this one, you can see between these, is the size of the screws. See, this one's got a small screw, small headed screws. This one's got much larger headed screws. Now underneath these heads, there are actually little anti-rattle washers that are actually set into the hole, into the recess in the receiver here. And looking on the net and looking at modern Henry H001s being disassembled, this design has carried through to the modern Henry rifles. Now the other thing you notice with this rifle is the colour of the wood. I've got a couple of these with this light coloured wood from early rifles, but all the later ones that I've got and parts have this darker wood. Now I'm pretty sure this is beech, this light wood is beech, but I think some of these some of the wood on these dark ones, I mean, obviously may have been stained, but some of it looks like walnut. I think that looks like walnut. I could be wrong. It may be just that they're staining them darker, but that seemed to be a change. They seem to have actually darkened the stocks in the later rifles. Now there's two important differences. There's one really important difference between these rifles which I'm going to explain now, and it's a safety feature. If you look at this old, very early rifle, if we watch the back of the bolt here in the hammer, when I open the lever, see what's happening now is when I open the lever, it's dropping the locking block out of the recess in the bolt, and that's allowing the bolt to go back slightly. But see that, I mean, when I move the bolt, it will actually eventually start pushing the hammer. But if you look at that, when I do just open and shut, the hammer's not moving. The hammer's sitting hard against the back, sitting hard against the firing pin. Now, if I look at this later model rifle, if we do the same thing, so if you look at this area again on this one, as soon as I start to move the lever, notice that the hammer comes back away from the firing pin and the bolt starts to come back. And it's only when the locking block goes up into its recess in the bolt or the breech block that the hammer can then go forward. So what this means is, it means that as soon as the rifle's unlocked, there's no way the hammer can actually, like if someone was to open the rifle now, if I was to pull the trigger, that can't actually fire because the hammer can't reach the firing pin. I've actually got another action which I'll actually get out and I can actually show it to you, to show you actually how it works. Alright, so here we have a action. This is from a later rifle. It's got the bigger screw heads on the takedown screws. But if you look here, you can see the locking bolt, which is actually sticking up. So if the breech block or bolt was sitting on there, that would be up in its recess in the bolt. As soon as we start to lower that down, you can see the hammer moves a little bit. And the reason for that is that the actual locking block as it moves is actually hitting a part of the front of the hammer down here. Now that doesn't happen in this early rifle, and I can show you why. Here we have two hammers, an early type and a late type. So this is the early type without the out of battery safety, and this is the late type. And as you can see, the top of the hammer is the same. All the firing surfaces, sear surfaces and everything are all basically the same, but it's just this part here. This part has the belly in it. And in fact, in this early one, this seems to be designed so that the actual locking block doesn't touch the hammer. That's why it has that. The locking block comes down into here and goes up. And I think it was only after that, when they realized that they really should have an out of battery safety, that they looked at how they could replace it. And all they did was redesign the hammer. So now, as the locking block comes down, the tail of it hits this part, which isn't present here, hits this part of the hammer and pushes it back a little bit. So while the locking block's down, the hammer can never come forward enough to actually hit the firing pin. But yeah, see the difference there? So this part here is the part that the locking block hits and pushes the hammer back a little bit. Whereas in the early rifle, the rocket just comes down in there and doesn't actually affect the hammer. Alright, so here's the old model, early model on the right, and a later model with out of battery safety on the left. So you can see the difference in the hammers, but I was just looking and comparing this, and actually there is a difference in the locking blocks themselves as well. If you look at this locking block with the safety, it has a longer, seems to have a longer tail coming out, sticking out the back. If you go onto the website of the Henry Firearms Manufacturing Company, the first thing you'll notice is their motto, made in the USA or not made at all. Along the top there's tabs, and one of them is actually history. So I kind of clicked on there expecting to see a bit of history about the formation of the modern Henry Rifle Company, and possibly even the design of this rifle. But all it has is just a brief history of the original Henry from the 1850s, and saying that the modern company continues the tradition of the Henry rifle. It is interesting though that this rifle is related in a way to both of those companies, because this rifle has Benjamin Tyler Henry's patented vertical moving cartridge lifter, and this design was modified slightly and became the design of the first modern Henry lever action, which no longer has the Henry system. I think it's interesting the way that this design has bridged the relationship between the old company and the new company. There we go. Let's just get that up in there. There. They're still coming out. They're still coming out. That's it. Only had one misfire that time. Wonder how easy it is to single load. Yeah, to single load it, you got to make sure that the lifter hasn't come up and got in the way. Now we'll be right, I think. You take them out.
Trigger's nice. There's a round in the chamber that time. I might have pulled the bolt apart, cleaned it out. That's the last one. All right. All right.
Oh boy, that's painful.
So that pretty much wraps it up. I've given you all the information I can find about the Erma EG71 and the Irma company. You'll notice in that shooting footage there was a few misfires. That was actually really only the first time I'd had it out and had a decent shot from it. So it does have an issue. I've actually got a video on misfires if you're interested in kind of working out why a rifle misfires, but after looking fairly closely, it's become obvious that rifle has some headspace issues. Now, I've actually got a whole heap of parts, and so really the only way that the headspace can be excessive is where the locking block comes up into the slot in the bottom of the bolt. So I've got a spare bolt and I've got several spare locking blocks, so I should be able to sort that out alright. But I am going to actually restore that rifle. I will do a step-by-step video on that. You'll see in that video I've got two complete Irma rifles now. So, and I'm in the process of restoring the other one at the moment. So yeah, stay tuned. There'll be a little bit more on Irmas yet. And until next time, thanks for watching.